Hi, I'm Mike Emerlon on the Office Ecosystem Marketing team, and today I'm going to talk about building applications on top of SharePoint. SharePoint provides the intelligent workplace in Office 365. As a developer, you can extend SharePoint in many ways to build for several scenarios. You can build customized site experiences for teams and departments and across the organization into team sites and communication sites. You can integrate your application with SharePoint, including using SharePoint as a launch point for connecting files and items to your applications. SharePoint also holds very valuable content in an organization, file documents and spreadsheets, the critical aspects that are critical to many roles and responsibilities. It's perhaps not surprising that developers often build extended processes and workflows around content. Finally, SharePoint can make a great choice for building business applications. As a developer, you can take advantage of structured lists, built-in user experiences, integrated security, and the knowledge that SharePoint has all of the governance and robustness of Office 365, giving you as a developer a huge boost to resolving how to get started with the logistics of hosting your own enterprise applications. Now, as a developer, when you get started with SharePoint, there are several flexible options for building user experiences, working with data, and building business logic and processes. For building user experiences, add-ins let you rehost and frame in existing experiences. Power Apps let you, as a developer, and also the users in your organization, easily craft apps and forms that are connected to SharePoint lists. And finally, the new SharePoint framework, which we'll dive into today, lets you build fast, responsive user experiences using modern client-side script technologies. To connect to SharePoint data, there are REST and client object model-based options. A new option is to be able to use Microsoft Graph REST-based APIs and SDKs to connect to site and list data as well, giving you a consistent way to access SharePoint data along with the rest of data across Office 365 like mail, users, groups, and more. Finally, there are several options for building processes and workflows on SharePoint, including ways for team members to design notifications and processes using Microsoft Flow. And as a developer, webhooks are available for list items and files that give you an opportunity to respond to changes in your own web services. Now let's get started considering how to extend the user experience of SharePoint. For web developers, the rate and change and evolution of frameworks across web development is quick. New practices and new libraries evolve every week. A key tenet of SharePoint development is to make it easy for web developers to build applications using the latest script libraries, frameworks, and tools. To support this, we've released the SharePoint Framework, a set of tools and libraries built into SharePoint that let you harness the latest web technologies for modern client-side development. SharePoint Framework, or SPFX, is also designed to be responsive and adaptable for mobile scenarios, including both mobile web browsers and the SharePoint mobile app. We use SharePoint Framework to build many default experiences in web parts in SharePoint, which helps make sure that the experiences you have are battle-tested and robust by the time you use them. They're also backwards compatible, including existing sites, as well as supporting new modern site experiences across SharePoint. And finally, SharePoint Framework comes with tools for developers to help them easily code in the JavaScript frameworks of their choice within SharePoint. Let's take a look at SharePoint Framework in action. So within SharePoint, we have new modern experiences for team sites and communication sites. Web parts are the foundation of these sites. They provide the building blocks that people can pull together to create really great functional sites. So in this case, for example, for Contoso Adventure Travel, we have this website which gives you a bit of an overview of the Contoso Adventure Travel program. And if I go ahead and edit it, what you can see is that there's a number of different web parts that come together here. For example, an image at the top, a header, a people profiles web part, a Contoso Adventure Travel bit of text, and then we have side-by-side images and text. We have slide presentations, picture libraries, and then things, like, for example, web parts, a map that you might have here that you can sort of zoom in and zoom out on. And of course, you can imagine other web parts, things like visualizations, charts, and the like. And the great news is that you can build your own custom web parts using the SharePoint framework. So in this case, I've got an adventure equipment site over here where I want to track the set of equipment that we as a company are lending out to people, in addition to having a change request system so that people can file issues with maybe some of the equipment that they're loaning. These are custom SharePoint framework web parts that you can download from github.com/SharePoint. There's a SharePoint Developer Solutions repository there. In this case, I've got a change request web part. I can say, Raft has a small leak, like so. Click Create. Say, near the front section, And this will create a new SharePoint list item behind the scenes, and that will get added into my change request web part. So you can build web parts that are similar to this. Let's take a look at how you do that. Now, with the SharePoint framework, it uses modern libraries and tools. So when we want to start a project, we're going to go to the command line and use a tool called Yeoman, which allows me to create a new project. So I've installed the SharePoint framework, and I'm going to use yo@Microsoft/SharePoint to start a new project. In this case, I might call my project Facilities. Let's say I want to track a list of facilities that we have. I can choose to either target the latest and greatest SharePoint framework version or target the version that was included with SharePoint Server 2016 if I want to build cross on-prem and Office 365 types of web parts. I can choose to use this folder. I have options about whether I want to make this tenant administrator deployable. And then finally, I can choose to build a web part here. And this will go ahead and do everything it takes to go provision a new SharePoint web part project for me. So this is a lot like File New Project inside of Visual Studio. Now, this takes a while typically to go and provision your site. So I'm actually going to go to a project that I've already created. And we're going to open up Visual Studio Code in this folder and get started editing our web part. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code. You can use your own different types of editors if you so choose. This is basically the project that was created as a result of that Yeoman tool. And so when I open up facilities webpart.ts here, what it's going to do is, behind the scenes, use TypeScript as the fundamental scripting language for creating these web parts. And in this case, it created a facilities web part base class, an empty one essentially, that derives from this base client-side web part base class where all SharePoint framework web parts derive from. Now, because I chose React as my developer framework for the user experience, it's going to turn around and in this render function go instantiate my facilities React component, which I have stored over here in facilities.tsx. And this is a very basic sample. Let me go start my build tool called gulp. I'll type in gulp serve. And so what this will do is it'll take all of the resources that are in this project, compile them behind the scenes, do all the web packing to make sure it's a very compressed project of only the code that I'm using, and then go host this web part inside of a debuggable server. So this is my Hello World web part that you see popping up in Edge here. It's going to open up a tool called the SharePoint Developer Workbench, which is a local tool that allows me to essentially simulate SharePoint so that I can do some very quick debugging and see how this part works. And I'm going to add my facilities web part, and you see I get a basic Hello World web part that comes when I first created this project. Now, what we want to do is go ahead and customize this. So to do that, I'm going to go extend it in a few different ways. Now, the way that the React framework works is that it uses a concept of state. And this concept of state is where all of our variables are tracked and all the sort of the information behind the scenes will flow into your user experience components. So in this case, I can add this iFacilities state object where what we're going to do is track a list of facilities, this items object here, and a selected facility. Next up, what we're going to do is we're going to then go add some imports. Now, there's a set of libraries you can use as a developer to make rich, robust web parts quickly called Office UI Fabric. And there's a particular library of Office UI Fabric React components that includes a lot of the things that we use in our out-of-the-box SharePoint user experience. Things like command bars and buttons and document cards that are available for you as a developer to use in your own SharePoint framework components. And so that's what we're going to do here. Next up, what I want to do in this web part is add a very simple, almost trivial constructor that will go ahead and pull in data from a web service. So in this case, I've got a constructor. It's going to go fetch some data from a JSON file on the internet. Obviously, you'd have probably a more sophisticated data retrieval algorithm here. For the sake of demo, I'm just doing something very simple. And then we have our render function. So I'm going to go overwrite this render function with something completely different. But what you can see here is this is some React markup that I have here for doing things like instantiating some of those various components and then binding them to the data that gets retrieved from that web service. So I've got a command bar up top, and then I've got this details list control where it's got a set of columns and a set of items, and it's bound to this.state.items, that set of things that I've retrieved from my web service. And it's got some actions that fire when I happen to actually click on an item through onItemInvoked. And when I do click on an item, what it's going to do is it's going to fill this document card with a preview of the facility so that I get a very rich view of that particular facility within my web part. So I'm going to go save this. And what will happen behind the scenes is that my gulp build tool will automatically pick that up, start rebuilding the project, run lint tools, run web packing tools. If I have an error, I'll get a little message that tells me that I've got an error. In this case, the project actually worked fine. And so now I've got my facilities web part. So it automatically reloaded it in the workbench, and now you see my rich list of facilities. And so when I double click on these, you can see that it will update that document card on the right-hand side of this web part to then the selected item. So this just shows you a little bit about how you can get started with SharePoint Framework to build SharePoint Framework web parts and get them into your sites. So from here, we'll talk a little bit down the road about building SharePoint Framework extensions. When it was released about 9 months ago, SharePoint Framework let you build web parts, which, as you've seen, are a key part of the SharePoint experience. Recently, we've extended the ways you can use script to customize SharePoint with SharePoint Framework extensions. SharePoint Framework extensions let you customize various additional facets of SharePoint. Application customizers let you add script to pages, including the ability to add things like analytic scripts. You can also customize the top and bottom of SharePoint pages across a site to add things like metadata displays or advanced compliance notifications. In addition, you can extend the menus and options of lists and libraries to react to them with scripts through a technology called command sets. Finally, you can customize the presentation of SharePoint lists by adding custom field renderings. For example, to add new visualizations or command options to list items. Let's take a look. So here is a site that I've customized using SharePoint Framework extensions across the application customizers, the command sets, and the list field customizers. So let's say that we've got a set of adventures that we're planning from the Contoso Adventure Travel Company. And so I'm using a SharePoint list to track that. Now, at the top of the page, what you can see here is a custom control that I've embedded into the page with a set of announcements and an overall status for this particular site. You can see it's got an announcement announcing accepting summer 2018 trip ideas and a bit of a status. Now, that's one type of customizer, the application customizer, that you can add to your page. Next, to actually customize the list itself, what you can see here is that I've added a couple of actions called Open this adventure site and Publish this adventure to the public. These are custom command set options I've added to the page, and when I click them, what it'll do is pop up a dialog where it'll give me a bit of information that gives me a preview of what this adventure will look like when we publish it to our website. This is powered by a bit of script that I've added along with that SharePoint Framework extension. Now finally, what you can also see is that we've added a set of locations here, and we've given a map-based visualization to them. So rather than just simply saying Belize City or Franz Reservoir, we actually have a little bit of a map preview that is embedded within the list that when you click it will give you a draggable type of map that you can use to see that particular adventure's locations in more detail. So these are three types of SharePoint Framework extensions we've added to this site. Now, if I come to see the code behind the scenes, it's very similar to that web part example that we saw earlier. You can see that in my Visual Studio Code project, there's a folder called Extensions, and I've added a number of different extensions to my project that implement these different types of extensions. So first up, I've got my training list header, that header at the top of the page. It starts with a TypeScript base class called Training List Header Application Customizer that, like a web part, actually derives from a base application customizer. And then what it'll do is when the extension actually gets initialized, it's going to go look for this placeholder. It's going to hook an event to do that. And then it will then go look for the top placeholder, which represents the top of the page. So if this placeholder exists, if we have a pointer to it, then from there what it'll do is it'll instantiate a React control that will then go ahead and render and place that custom component at the top of my page. And what you can see here is this is a very standard React component, very similar to the example I just showed you on the web part. It's going to go fetch some data and then go render it with a React template. Now let's take a look at one more, that command set customizer that I added that added additional menu options. Now this SharePoint Framework extension starts with a JSON file where I've added a couple of actions and described things like their icon image and their title. Next, what will happen is your command set will also derive from a base class. This one derives from base list view command set. And then what happens is when it actually gets executed, it's going to call a bunch of functions, in this case a to-do, but the other one has a function which will show an open dialog that you can then do the preview of that particular adventure and how it will look on the public-facing website. So this just shows you how you can essentially register new command set actions, and then you can write JavaScript behind the scenes that will intercept those actions, and you can write scenarios to your heart's content using the power of SharePoint Framework and JavaScript. Now, since we've launched the SharePoint Framework, the set of changes and updates since then have kept on coming. We recently added support for SharePoint Framework web parts in the on-premises SharePoint Server 2016 product via Feature Pack 2. This makes it possible to build web parts that run across both SharePoint in Office 365 and on-premises from one code base. We've also added recent frequently requested features such as application lifecycle APIs to make it easier to manage solutions, a site collection app catalog that provides new flexibility for managing deployments, asset packaging that makes it easier to host applications, and new connections from SharePoint Framework to Graph APIs. All of these are coming soon. Now, SharePoint Framework makes it easy to extend and embed web experiences within SharePoint, but what if you want to access core SharePoint data, lists, and files outside of SharePoint? For example, maybe you want to build a web service or create a custom mobile application. For that, we've added extended support for SharePoint sites and lists within Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph is an easy-to-use, consistent REST-based API for accessing key data across Microsoft and including Office 365. You can access SharePoint list APIs in the Microsoft Graph, starting by accessing a site. Now, to access a site, you'll use the v1.0 Sites API, add a URL or a site ID for that site, and from there, you can add the list APIs to enumerate lists and use the list identifier to get specific list data. You can also inspect things like content types and custom columns for a list. Let's take a look. So one example of using SharePoint List APIs is in mobile applications. Maybe you're building something for iOS, for Android, and you want to build that, let's say, with Xamarin. So to get started, there's a project called Active Directory Xamarin Native-v2, which is a project you can find on GitHub. And what this does is it's a very simple Xamarin project that implements a way to connect to Microsoft Graph. Now, when you want to build an application that connects to Microsoft Graph, you need three things. First, you need an application registration, which you can get at apps.dev.microsoft.com, or you can get from your Azure portal. If you look in Active Directory, you can register new applications. This will give you an identifier and a set of basic permissions that your application requests. Next up, what you need to do is authenticate against your Active Directory and have the user sign in. Now, to do that, we use a library called the Microsoft Authentication Library, or MSAL, or also known as Microsoft.identity.client. Now, what this will do is I've got some simple lines of code that use MSAL up top. What this is going to do is it's going to say, hey, has the user already signed in? Let's go acquire their token silently if possible. And if they're signed in, it will return a token. Now, if the user is not signed in, we're going to present them with a button to ask them to go ahead and sign in. We're going to call the MSAL library called acquire token async method, which will pop up a dialog where the user actually goes ahead and signs in. And if that's all successful, and if we get a authentication token back, then we're actually able to do part 3, which is use that authentication token that we got from our authentication library to go make some Microsoft Graph calls. So that's actually contained down here, and you can see that this is just really simple REST calls. In this case, I'm going to structure a new HTTP message, and it's going to go to graph.microsoft.com/v1.0/me. I'm going to pass in that token that I got into the bearer header, and from there, it's really just simple JSON-based REST calls. And so when I hit F5 and open up this application, what you'll see is it's a very, just brutally simple Xamarin starter application. I'm going to have a blank form. In this case, I'm running it within the UWP version of Xamarin, so you'll see it as a Windows application, but of course this would also work as an Android application or as an iOS application. So it's going to go start that up. Now I think in this case I've probably already signed in, so you're not going to see the sign-in process, but what you would have seen is that a dialog popped up. I typed in my name and password, and then the application continued. So in this case, it's accessing Microsoft Graph and pulling in some information about me, just basically. Now, what we want to do here is actually now add some SharePoint-specific information. And we have a list of, for example, organizations that our company is working with that we want to connect into this application. So to do that, I'm just going to go edit this, and I'm going to come to my XAML, and I'm going to hit and add some markup in here, a simple layout, a label, and some additional labels in a table view that are going to hold some additional data that I'm going to pull into this application. And then I'm going to go into my main page XAML code behind and add some additional code for that as well. So let me go scroll down here. This is basically the code that I had before, which took some information about me and put it into some XAML controls. I'm going to add some more code. That's what it's going to do is it's going to call this endpoint graph.microsoft.com/sites/ the name of my tenancy. This is my developer tenancy. I'm going to go find a specific subsite in there, /sites/adventure equipment. I'm going to go find a specific SharePoint list called organizations, And then finally what I'll do is I'll say, give me those items, and then pull down all the custom fields and the data that are associated with them. I'm going to say expand equals fields. And then from there, again, just standard REST requests. I'm going to go pull down that data and then go fill out some Xamarin and XAML UI with the results of that. So now, when I start this project up, just pulling in a little bit more information on top of that, what you'll see is it'll pull some basic information about the site, the title, but then in addition, it's now going to pull in sort of the set of list items that came from that SharePoint list. So you can see here, it gave me the site URL, the site last modified time, and then I have this scrollable list of the different organizations and their logos that came from my SharePoint list. Now, it's not the prettiest thing in the world by a long stretch, but hopefully you can see how you can get started with using SharePoint list APIs in your applications. Now, one more different example I want to show you is building SharePoint data and pulling that into Microsoft Teams. So Teams has a way to extend it called a tab. And so with a tab, what you can do is actually go build additional tools for your teams. So for example, in this case, if I go to my, let's go over to my bike sales team. What you'll see is I've actually added an additional tab here called Supplier Organizations. And this is a tab that I've developed. And what it will do is it'll reach out to my list of organizations that I have up on my site and pull that data in and show it as a tab. So if I'm working together with my team and I want to do a quick lookup or find some relevant documents, you can embed that inside of Microsoft Teams. Now, tabs are implemented essentially as web pages. So if you can build a web page, you can build a tab inside of Microsoft Teams. Now, in my case, what I'm doing is I'm actually connecting that page behind the scenes back to some SharePoint list data. So let's take a look at how that works. You can do things like drill into organizations as well, by the way. Pretty cool stuff. So let's take a look at that implementation. Now, this will look very similar to the example I just showed you. It's just in JavaScript, and it has a lot more sort of details to it. But what you can see here is the first step is really to authenticate and have the user sign in and make sure that they're logged in. To do that, again, I'm going to use my application identifier that I've retrieved, and I'm going to go use some JavaScript libraries to then go handle the sign-in process. So there's this authentication context library that came with my authentication JavaScript library. It's going to do all the things to say like, oh, by the way, if you're not signed in, go acquire a token and sign you in. In this case, I'm going to use some Microsoft Teams specific APIs to pop up authentication dialogues if I need to. And so that's a way to sort of really get started and to get that authentication token. Now, there's some other user experience items down here, but let me just scroll down just a little bit. And what you'll see here is when it comes time to go retrieve a list of documents, so one of the things this tab did was showed a list of relevant documents. Again, you can see here that the actual request to retrieve data via Microsoft Graph is just simple JSON REST-based requests. So I'm going to go instantiate this Graph API at v1.0/sites/site ID/lists, and then pass in my list identifier, and then I'm going to, again, go retrieve the set of items with their fields expanded. I'm going to pass in my graph token into the bearer header that you can see over here. And then in JavaScript, again, it's just parsing of those responses and then populating out my HTML user experience from that. So I'm going to go loop over all those document list items that I got back from SharePoint and then go fill out the various divs and HTML elements with that content. So you can see it's very similar to the Xamarin example in a sense, just JavaScript versus C#, if you will. But that shows you hopefully how easy it is to get started using Microsoft Graph to retrieve data from SharePoint lists. So that's a tour of the ways that you can take advantage of the latest SharePoint APIs and tools to build hyper-productive experiences for your users, from web parts to site extensions to applications that integrate with SharePoint. You can read more about SharePoint at dev.office.com/SharePoint and experiment with SharePoint Graph APIs at graph.microsoft.com. Now, SharePoint has a large community, starting with the SharePoint Developer Tech community, and you can provide suggestions to our team at our SharePoint user voice. I want to especially call out the SharePoint GitHub repository at github.com/SharePoint, which has dozens of community-contributed samples you can access and get started with. It's really an unparalleled community contribution you should take advantage of. Take a moment to review all the ways you can use SharePoint in your next project, and use these resources to get started in building your first parts and extensions. Happy coding!